Hello and welcome to the Creative Career Toolkit. My name is Andrew Macklin. I'm an actor. I'm also a qualified and ICF accredited career coach for creatives. In each one of the videos in this series, we'll be looking at a different model or tool that you can use in relation to your career as a whole or individual creative projects that you could be working on in order to try and create some new options for yourself in moving yourself or those projects forward. Each one of the models has got an evidence base to it, and today's model is no different. So in today's video, we'll be looking at a model of the process of change. So this is a psychological model that comes from behavioral science. It's got about 20 years of research behind it. And you might be asking, well, why is such a model interesting or useful for us as creatives? And I personally think that if there's one thing that we will all need to work on as creatives, it's that idea of change. So if we find ourselves in our career at a place of plateau, perhaps, and we feel like a change is needed, that change might be around developing and learning new skills, or it could be around a wider career change, which we know can be common over the course of individual careers anyway. So there's about 7 stages to this particular model, so I'm going to quickly bring us through them. As we do that, if you can relate some of the steps in this model perhaps to a change that you are trying to make or thinking of making, perhaps a habit or something new you're trying to bring into your practice that you're struggling to get to grips with, it can be really useful. I'm going to look at it from the perspective of, say, a musician that's looking to add music teaching to their practice. So here we are with the model of the process of change. So you can see here on the right-hand side that the very first part of that is a pre-contemplation stage. So it's important, I think, to recognize that change begins at the level of insight. So it begins with this sense, a feeling, an idea that perhaps something needs to change, that perhaps some needs of ours aren't being met, or just at the idea of pure insight level. So this feeling and sense can lead us towards more explicit thinking, which is contemplation. So at this point, if I'm that musician, I might be quite actively thinking now as to if I want to bring teaching into my practice, how do I go about doing that? In what ways would it be useful for me? What might be the steps involved be? So that contemplation period leads us to active preparation. So I'm really beginning to form my thinking at that stage. So who might I need to help me with this might be a question. What kind of things do I need to be doing or thinking about in order to bring this teaching practice into my career as a whole? Which then leads us inevitably towards, and hopefully, towards action. So here is where we begin to make much more explicit actions in real life. So moving out of our headspace and very much into the active world. So at this stage, I might be looking at, well, perhaps are there books I need to be finding and reading about teaching as a whole? Perhaps I need to put aside an hour or two to look at a workshop I might want to create. Perhaps I'm thinking about reaching out to individual people and sending them emails. And this action stage, in order for change to be sustainable, necessarily means we move to this maintenance stage, which is often a particularly difficult and challenging stage. So in maintenance, we're looking about keeping that change process rolling. So in relation to that musician, it might be around keeping up the emails out to people around the idea that I'm now adding teaching to my process. It might be about maintaining that idea of learning as I go and maintaining my practices as to learning how to structure workshops for myself. As you might imagine, this stage often leads us to relapse. So perhaps we find it difficulty in maintaining some of those skills and changes, and we find ourselves falling out of that practice. So maybe not reading enough of those books perhaps, or stopping reaching out to people, or stopping thinking about that as something we want to add to our practice, and we find ourselves back at contemplation. So at contemplation, we recognize that, the teaching idea, it's still there. We still recognize it as being a valuable one, but we've just sort of fallen out of the loop of maintaining it. So we go around the cycle again, from preparation, what could we do differently this time perhaps, into action. So maybe deciding for yourself that actually, if I had a friend to help keep me accountable with this, that would really help me to maintain this. And we get to maintenance again. Now, typically we may go through this change process, this cycle, including relapse, several times, 3 or 4 or 5 or more, as many that are as needed for us to be able to incorporate all of the skills and thinking around this to be able to maintain it. So when we get to that level, the change which we're trying to make is one that becomes part of our identity. It very much becomes embedded in the way that we think about ourselves and the ways in which we behave typically and the ways in which we think about our careers. It takes less cognitive work for us to go about those habits and those ideas and pursuing that line of thinking. And we get to this stage of integration where, as I say, it just becomes part of our practice, part of what we do and part of how we see ourselves. And as you can see at the bottom of this model as well, we have this ambivalence line, which just recognizes the fact that over any course of human change, we will naturally have periods of ambivalence. It's present throughout. So ambivalence is very much represented in that idea of doubt. So periodically there'll be questions as I go through the change process that says, you know, am I good enough to be doing this? Is this something that's right for me? This is all very new and very strange. Can I manage it? And just to recognize that this is a very normal thing for us to go through as we go through that change process. So that is the model of change. And like I say, I think it's particularly useful for any of us who are thinking about developing new skills as creatives, as part of our practice, perhaps moving ourselves out of that plateau that we might find ourselves in when we feel a little bit stuck in our careers, or indeed about changing our career as a whole. And I find it particularly useful when I'm working with creatives in coaching around two ideas. One, around recognizing that failure and relapse is a very necessary and inevitable part of change. We can often, I think, find ourselves in this societal way of thinking that recognizes failure as being inherently bad and perhaps an indicator that we shouldn't be doing the kind of change that we're trying to make. And that isn't always true. We know from this model that a natural process will be for us to go through several phases of relapse and failure. And also that idea of ambivalence as well. Quite often we can fall into, I guess, the mistake of thinking that those doubts mean that we have to stop what we're doing, as opposed to recognizing maybe the psychological truth that just ambivalence and those doubts will always be a periodical part of our change overall. So that is the process of the model of change. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you can feel some relevance to it, perhaps to the changes you're trying to make in your own career, and find it useful in managing those changes and managing your expectations around them for yourself. I've been Andrew Macklin. This has been a pleasure to talk to you, and I'll see you on the next Creative Career Toolkit.